Everybody, welcome back to our second talk today at today's Burnout Conference. It's from Professor Josh Cohen. Josh is a psychoanalyst in private practice and professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's the author of numerous books and articles on modern literature, psychoanalysis, and cultural theory. His books include How to Read Freud, The Private Life, Not Working, and How to Live. He has written for The Guardian, The New Statesman, and TLS, and appeared on BBC Radio 4. This is actually Professor Cohen's second engagement with the Weekend University. I think he spoke at our second ever event back in, it would have been February 2018, which is quite some time ago. So there you go. But it's great to have him back with us for this event. So Josh, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started. And it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Niall. Yeah, it's lovely to be invited to do this, and that you have a focus on burnout. When I started writing the book from which this talk really emerges, it's called Not Working, Why We Have to Stop. When I started working on Not Working, burnout was not anywhere near as, I'm talking about, it was published in 2019. So in the sort of 2 or 3 years beforehand, burnout was not so much in regular circulation. It wasn't part of the vocabulary of our daily lives in the way that it's come to be over the last few years. And so it's great and feels very resonant for me to see an entire afternoon dedicated to it. I don't know about you, but I shudder to think how rich I might be if I had £1 for every email I write apologizing for not having done some mundane administrative task. Did I write that reference? Did I write that report? Did I fill in that form? No, I didn't. I am so desperately, abjectly sorry. And then, of course, what happens, at least with me, and I suspect 1 or 2 at least of you, is that you start finding it hard to avoid this tone of abject yet oddly self-righteous apologism when you make excuses, because the apologies are a little ambiguous. You say how sorry you are, but then you talk about how incredibly busy you are, how many important things you have to do. And of course, the thing I have to do for you is really burnished on my heart, right? That is next in the inbox. That's right at the top of the pile. There is a kind of wish to convey to the bearers of all these demands that they recognize our tardiness, not as an effect of our laziness or our shiftlessness or our haplessness, but on the contrary, it's to do with our doing so much, our being so very productive, so purposeful. We are enthralled to a robust work ethic. And I think that in our culture of overwork and hyperactivity, being so busy becomes a kind of source, and the ultimate source in a way, of our pride and of the meaning of our lives. And so I want to now say a bit about the historical origins of this attitude, because it hasn't always been this way. I think it hasn't always been the way that work has been the dominant value of our culture. And this predominance of the robust work ethic is a symptom of a particular economic system, because every economic system requires the unnoticed yet pervasive support of a particular culture and a particular collective psychological mindset in order for everyone to buy into a particular economic system. They have to function in a particular way. And so we have a manically productive economy, which we might call high capitalism or late capitalism. Left-wingers love the gag that, you know, late capitalism is a very optimistic designation. But the mindset that supports this manically productive economy is, of course, called capitalism. Capitalism was famously analyzed all the way back 117 years ago now, in 1905, by an incredibly prescient study by the great German sociologist Max Weber. Many of you will have heard of this essay called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he tries to explain really why capitalism took hold of the world. And he explains why it is that work has acquired such a privileged but also a very fraught place in our identities, in the way that we've come to understand ourselves. And he shows how over the course of 3 centuries, so in other words, between the Reformation of the late 16th century and his own, the time he was writing, 1905, so now we would have to say 4 centuries, psychology and culture entrenched the modern work ethic deep in the self. The various Protestant movements to emerge from the Reformation infused the order of work, which was a secular order, right? Work, in a way, was what you did when you weren't in church, when you weren't praying, when you weren't involved in some aspect of community ritual life. But the Reformation made work itself and the accumulation of wealth a spiritual activity. And the key word here in the Protestant lexicon is calling. The word in German that Weber uses is Beruf, which means calling, but also, of course, the great English word vocation, right, which also means calling. And the calling transforms work from something pragmatic, right, a means to get something, to a sacred end in itself. So in the economies that preceded capitalism, what Weber calls traditionalist economies, economies that are based on mainly on agrarian life, and is governed by the rhythm of the seasons. In those economies, work, Weber explains, was simply a means for a worker to live in the manner to which he, and if he has one, his family, her family, have become accustomed. It's about reproducing yourself. It's about sustaining yourself. It's about a kind of subsistence. When Luther comes along, when the Reformation comes along and says work is a calling, suddenly work is not something you do with your body to maintain your existence, but it's a calling from the soul. And it's much more difficult then to not work or to stop working temporarily without feeling inadequate or guilty, because in a way you're cheating your own vocation, you're cheating your calling if you're not working, right? So you probably know the famous catchphrase of Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street, the classic 80s movie Wall Street starring Michael Douglas. He says, lunch is for wimps. But that idea that taking out a short period of time in the middle of the day to simply sustain yourself, to feed your body, to rest and to pause, well, the idea that that's for wimps is the logical conclusion, really, of the elevated status of work. Once you say that work is the thing that matters in our lives, then it makes sense to say that lunch is for wimps. Making work sacred. Protestant movements like Calvinism brought a new imperative of purpose into everyday living. And one of the things this meant was that time, daily time, right, your and my time, was invested with the highest value. So Weber quotes the English Puritan minister Richard Baxter, who says, "Keep up a high esteem of time and be every day more careful that you lose none of your time, that you lose none of your gold or silver." Time is more valuable than gold or silver. Time means, in this sense, keeping a tight leash on the direction of your daily life. Do not stray, do not meander, do not idle into unexpected detours unless it has a particular profit or purpose. But then it's not really a detour, is it? If it's got a profit and a purpose, then it's the thing that you need to be doing. It's when you start taking time out from the purposeful or productive activity that you're in trouble. So capitalism successfully established this new privilege of work in our culture. It spread it in all kinds of ways, in the growth of cities, in technologies, in the rise of corporations, the rise of consumer culture. It is a collective mentality that I think it's fair to say takes an unmistakable toll on our physical lives, but also on our psychic lives. And conversely, it imposes a kind of shame on impulses and urges that are non-working. So the impulse to rest, the impulse to drift aimlessly, the impulse to stop. Now, we could think of this as being, after all, the natural order of things. The idea that, human beings, after all, are meant to work. Now, for me, this is problematic because it's true that we are active, working, productive beings, but this is not the whole truth of us. There is a dimension of our selfhood which is concentrated, I want to say, in being rather than doing. Now, if you look at the various accounts in the history of civilization of cosmic order, what are called the ancient theogonies, right? Theogonies are basically the cast of characters in the divine order of the gods. And they give us the gods as embodiments of specific emotions, of modes of existence. There's a god of love, there's a god of hate, there's a god of war, there's a god of art, and so on. And the thing is, the gods we've made famous are the really active gods. In the theogony of Hesiod, which introduces us to the Greek gods, or the Mahabharata, which introduces us to the Hindu gods, we are interested in the febrile, creative, amatory, warlike exploits, intrigues, battles between the gods or between gods and mortals. So we elevate the active, creative gods. And yet there is a more subterranean region of the cosmic order that is peopled by a more idle constellation of gods. In Hindu theogony, Lakshmi is the creation and consort of Vishnu, and she personifies good fortune, purity, and elegance. But she has a sister. Her sister is called Jayastha, and Jayastha is the cosmic balance to Lakshmi. Where Lakshmi is slim and beautiful and elegant, Jayastha is fat and unkempt and ugly. She represents a kind of divine slackness, and it's sort of represented in the abundant, drooping flesh, as though her body itself says no to being productive, to being purposeful. She sort of just spreads everywhere. In Greek theogony, there's a whole portion of the cosmos that's reserved for the gods of night, of sleep, of doing nothing. So in Hesiod, Erebos, who's the god of darkness, comes together with the goddess of night, Nyx, to conceive Hypnos, who is the god of sleep. Hypnos, in turn, fathers with Pasithea, who's the goddess of relaxation, three lords of the kingdom, Morpheus, of course, familiar to you from the Matrix, Phobator and Phantasos, and each of those look after different regions of dream life. So Hypnos is a kind of court, right? A court of sleep. And guarding all of that is the goddess Aegea. And Aegea literally means inactivity. She is a goddess of sloth. So she's born actually of Gaia, who is the earth, and Ether, who is the air. So you've got two primordial life forces, earth and air, merging to create an anti-life force, a cosmic protector of doing nothing. So why do I talk about all this? Simply to say that in the earliest forms of human anthropology, human self-understanding, there is a portion of life, a big portion of life, that is given over to something other than work, than creativity, than productivity. Sleep and dreaming and lazing about is not just something that we do in the intervals between work, a kind of contingent nothing that sort of fills the gaps between the really meaningful stuff. No, there is something in the cosmic order about not doing that is itself meaningful. Let's go back to those excuses. When I really think about those excuses, I feel a bit of a tinge of shame at myself because I don't give honest answers, right? None of us do. None of us say, I didn't have time to send the passport scan or to fill in the employer's evaluation form because I used the time in which I would have done the thing that you've asked me to do. I used that time staring gormlessly out of the window, shoving ginger nuts in my gob, while thinking up, moronic rhyming schemes, or remembering favorite TV advertising jingles from the 1980s, and so on. Right. I mean, I'm kind of being flippant, having a laugh, but at the same time, everyone has that kind of that inner moron in their head, that kind of enjoys this kind of background noise of nonsense that runs through the mind. And I think that we're not very curious about it, right? We're not very, so I've just seen in the chat that Jessica has said, I'm glad I'm not the only one. So you're definitely not the only one. I can assure you. Because I think that sort of background noise is more than background noise. It represents an element of ourselves that kind of pulls away and resists the purposeful, task-directed dimension of being a person. So my posture of responsible task orientation feels often to me more like a kind of an imposture. I keep long hours. I was saying this to Niall before, that I work long hours because, that is the nature of modern life. If you want to survive and not wear rags or not heat your house. But temperamentally, spiritually, I have a lot of time for laziness, for sluggishness, for torpidness. I always did. These were things that I was called by the adults around me, by family, by teachers. And actually, it was also how I felt a lot of the time as a kid. I think kids are much more in touch with these impulses in themselves and much less ashamed of them. These days, I sort of cover all that stuff up, but it hovers under the surface in me. As a kid, I would always lag behind the task at hand. I processed instructions before, I barely processed the instructions before everyone else had actually executed the instructions. I was 200 meters into the cross-country run when everybody else had finished it, etc. I got interested in this subject, partly in a kind of solidarity with that kid that I was, almost, I think, in tribute to that kid that I was, who makes me a little embarrassed at all these hasty email assurances. There's something about this kid that reminds me that there is something quietly pernicious about our unwillingness to recognize this inactive dimension of ourselves. Why do we need to be doing and acting all the time? Why do we outlaw or have no curiosity about other states of being? It seems to me that we are a culture that increasingly can recognize the humanity of others only in what they do, and that is a restriction of our individual and collective imagination. And I think it's enforced, of course, by social media and its encouragement to parade our virtuous dedication to activity. The thing that is so remarkable about social media is that it can represent not just work, but leisure, wellness regimes. It can present resting itself as another activity to be anxious about failing in. Do you know what I mean? That those sort of pictures that you see of a sort of single sunbed beside an impossibly luxuriant infinity pool, looking over a green horizon, and some glassy-eyed model is lying on the bed in sunglasses, looking sort of impervious and so elegantly listless. And you think, I'm sure I don't look like that when I rest. It feels like, you know, resting is also something that you have to get good at. There is, I think, an entire repertoire of moods, like boredom, like indifference, like lassitude. Anything that orients to aimlessness, to pointlessness, to zoning out, to going slack. It's being excluded from the range of our inner lives. It's as though it doesn't deserve a place in the pantheon of feelings and of daily experiences. And I actually think that this excludes a rich and important seam of our humanity. It's almost as though we don't really want to acknowledge the existence of inner experience at all, as though only our attestable and externally viable actions had any meaning, had any value. We place so much premium on efficiency, on clearing inboxes. Ticking boxes means more than addressing the real questions and problems. We want our depression resolved with a few sessions of counsel, take-home exercises. We want our daily exhaustion addressed by a quick lunchtime session of mindfulness, squeezed in between meetings. I'm not knocking meditation, mindfulness, yoga at all. They're wonderful things. I'm just interested in the way that modern consumer culture has adapted them so that instead of being meaningful exits from the circuit of productivity and purpose, they become, in fact, another task inside that circuit. And that to me is a kind of travesty of what these exercises mean philosophically, because I think that meditation and yoga are about recognizing that there is more to the human being than productivity. Yoga is so often sold as something now, as something that will enhance your productivity, as opposed to something that will enhance your capacity to be with yourself. So rather than sit with what might be ailing us, to give some rein to our curiosity about ourselves, we demand of ourselves and of others that we get back to work as quickly as possible. And non-work is a kind of temporary aberration to be gotten over. It's not a meaningful part of our experience. And I think this is something that we all feel. And it would be interesting maybe in the Q&A to talk a bit about pandemic, because I wrote this book before the pandemic, and I obviously got contacted a lot about it during the pandemic, because the pandemic at first seemed to sort of give us back a bit of contact with that being dimension of ourselves, that non-working dimension of ourselves. But then I think it also brought back eventually it brought back the sort of imperative of activity with a vengeance. But we can talk about this. I'm starting from the premise that burnout has become the defining malaise of our culture. And I get a kind of partial but detailed sense of this atmosphere of enforced anxious overactivity in my work as a psychoanalyst, where it pervades my consulting room. I'm listening really daily to women and men pressed in from all sides by the demands to work more and work harder, as employers, as parents, as consumers, as lovers, yearning for a little stillness, a little reclusion, a momentary break in the flow of the noise. Often people seem to enjoy their psychoanalytic sessions simply because it's the guarantee of 50 minutes in the day, in the week, where they can be guaranteed a quiet room and a closed door, and to be able to speak and think about oneself without interruption. In other words, with burnout, it's not just about coming to therapy to discuss your life problems, although of course that's there, but simply to exit for a moment from this frenetic merry-go-round. Though as work is proclaimed the highest value, so non-work is loudly condemned in shrill tabloid fantasies of welfare scroungers and migrants who enjoy easy lives at our expense. There's been a drive among Western governments, both sort of left and right of centre, withholding and denying benefits to the disabled, for example, on the back of brutal and ill-informed assessments of fitness to work. Everyone who seeks non-working benefits is asked really to justify themselves very minutely. Modern life seems to jam our off switch, to keep us awake and anxious in a state of perpetual innovation. So I want to spend the last part of the talk just asking how it is that we can recover some small sense of peace, of a kind of return to ourselves. What can we do to cultivate the non-working impulse? Obviously not to replace the working impulse, because one extreme is not best remedied by moving to the other extreme. But how do we acknowledge the non-working as part of who we are? What I did in not working was to explore the different character types that have felt and resisted the always on, overacted, overstimulated culture of modern life. And I tried to find clues there. So I identified 4 types that I call the burnout, the slob, the daydreamer, and the slacker. They could, of course, been called many other things. You could have parceled it out in many different ways. I chose those. None of them are ideal types. None of them, that is, are intended to embody the life that we would desire if we were living properly. In fact, what they're doing is simply enjoining us. They are aspects of ourselves, I think, that are neglected in modern culture. And for that reason, I find these types interesting. So I start with a character that I call the burnout. One of the early inspirations for this project was my recall of an anarchist poster that I would see when I took trips in half term to Carnaby Street, which was not then, in the early and mid 80s. It was not sort of the oasis of refined consumer culture that it is today. It was sort of the epicenter of punk consumerism. And, you would go into these weird shops and it would be full of sort of t-shirts and badges for obscure bands and weird posters. And this anarchist poster, well, you can see, I don't go to work today. I don't think I'll go tomorrow. Let's take control of our lives and live for pleasure, not pain, right? So pleasure, not pain. Pain, I think, on this model is simply kind of agitation, right? It's the opposite of the image in the poster. Pleasure is not ecstasy or something very exciting. It's a state of sort of even homeostasis. A much more negative and disturbing image of burnout, which happens to be one of the most, perhaps the most, I don't know, arguably, certainly the most iconic work of British art of the last, say, 30 years. It's from 1999, and it is, of course, by Tracey Emin, and it's called My Bed. So that's one version of it. Here's a detail. I know it's completely disgusting. It's a kind of empty bed that Tracey Emin reconstructed and put in a gallery. It was a bed that she said she had spent weeks in, following a depressive breakdown after the end of a relationship. And so she surrounds herself with these debris and disgusting sort of detritus of a depressive breakdown. You'll see there are contraceptive devices, there are half-finished bottles of alcohol, there are takeaway wrappers, there are sachets of condiments, there are used condoms, there's all kinds of horrid stuff. Obviously, ashtrays full of cigarette butts, etc. Very manky, disgusting. And she sort of teleported this scene, this scene of her broken down self in her bedroom to a gallery. And of course, the thing that she can't take into the gallery is her own body. So the image hints at an absent body occupying the bed, which is chronically weary and inert. It's withdrawn from the daylight world of work and leisure. This is not a bed of peaceful rest. It's not a bed of airy dreams, of joyful coupling. It's a bed of illness, of exhaustion and despair. Sometimes in my more extravagant moment, I think my bed could almost be called our bed. That is, it represents the state of sort of broken down exhaustion that many of us feel at different points of our days, at different points of the year, different points of our lives. There's lots of intoxicants and contraceptives, as I said, in the picture, but they don't convey something like a lively appetite, right? They convey a kind of physical and psychic numbness. So the burnout really is that character who has finally succumbed to the overwhelming burden of stimulus and demand that the world imposes. Rather different from the character that we might call the slob. Because where the burnout collapses against her own will and intention, the slob, on the contrary, embraces lassitude and gluttony and entitlement as a way of life. And the observation I want to make here is simply think of various sort of culture heroes. Think of Snoopy or Garfield. Think of Lebowski from the cult movie The Big Lebowski. Think, of course, of the uber slob Homer Simpson, and of course Barney as well. Why, on the one hand, do we disown and disavow our slobbish impulses? No one, for God's sake, would ever sort of, well, not no one, no, some people do, but not many people sort of want to advertise themselves as disgusting slobs. And yet, we love these characters, right? They are folk heroes. They are sort of contemporary folk heroes. I think what we do with these guys, they are generally guys, which is interesting. The whole gendering of slobbishness is very interesting because up until recently, it's really only men who are allowed to be slobs, and then there's sort of the emergence of something like a female slob, which can only be a good thing. But I think we use them to outsource our own slobbishness, right? We love them because that's a way of loving that aspect of ourselves that we are not allowed to love in ourselves. So we can love those impulses from a safe distance. Now look at the landscape of The Simpsons, the lard lad donuts. These are the colors of contented suburban decadence, right? It's a landscape of easy gratification, of casual waste. It's a nirvana of inanity, right? Duff beer. And of course, the donuts. Homer's great slogan of slobbish entitlement is, why can't someone else do it? He actually, in one episode, runs for political office on exactly that slogan. Why can't someone else do it? Brilliant. Confronted by the demand to face reality, he thinks ever more defiantly into the life of aimless sloth that most of us have been forced resentfully to give up. Our next type is the daydreamer. And the thing is that the burnout and the slob have succumbed to the downward force of gravity, right? The daydreamer and the last of the four types, the slacker, they sort of float above gravity in a kind of airy defiance about it. Daydreaming is the refusal to equate life with the burden of everyday existence. Oscar Wilde, you know, the great thing about Wilde is that he loved to invert received wisdom in a kind of scandalous way. The famous one, of course, is work is the curses of drunken classes. But it's a kind of inversion of received wisdom. He was responding to the idea that artists are pretty useless people, that they're just dreamy escapists. They're not useful in the way that practical men and women are. And he says, but what if we thought of practical men and women who are actually dreamy escapists? And what he meant was that too often our busyness, our frenetic activity is just covering over, disguising its own emptiness. So he came up with another glorious formulation. Action, he says, is the refuge of people who have nothing whatsoever to do. I mean, I think you have to love that. Action is the refuge of people who have nothing whatsoever to do. Now, take Emily Dickinson. perhaps the greatest poet of the 19th century, perhaps one of the greatest poets of all time, in my humble opinion. If you look at her adult life, the largest part of her adult life, she locks herself up in her bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts. And all she does there is sit at a table scratching out poems. She scratches out nearly 2,000 of them. She doesn't do anything else. She literally sits in that bedroom. She comes on occasionally, I guess, to eat and drink. She has to use the bathroom occasionally with Sue. But one of these poems, number 657, is a kind of homage to the superiority of daydreaming, the superiority that is of imaginative over active life. And she writes, this is the opening stanza: I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. Now, prose is Dickinson's disparaging term of worldly life, to which she opposes not poetry, but possibility. I dwell in possibility. To write poetry, to create, is to occupy the house of possibility, the home of the daydreamer, whose numerous windows open in all directions. The thing about daydreaming is that it opens up many different vistas, not just the bald reality in front of us. And finally, there is the type I call the slacker. Obviously, I didn't make up that term, but the life of a slacker is governed by what the French writer Roland Barthes called the idiorhythm. And the idiorhythm is the idea of living according to a rhythm of your own, alongside everyone else, living according to theirs. That is refusing the regimentation of time and space that is imposed by labor and scheduled life, right? We all, in a sense, are railroaded into living the same time and the same rhythm. The idiorhythm is the suggestion that we could actually occupy our own rhythmic spaces, to give yourself over to the pace and style of the impulses, the curiosities, the desires that are unique to you. But it's also a kind of social ideal, whereby the rhythms of all our individual lives coexist without encroaching on each other. We give each other space to be who the other is, rather than assuming that everybody has to march to the same beat. So here's a final slide, just the movie by Richard Linklater's debut movie, Slacker, from 1991, a very inspirational film for me. Linklater's film was really the embodiment of this spirit. It was a series of randomly connected episodes from the subcultures of Austin, Texas, teeming with amateur metaphysicians, with tinkerers and petty criminals and anarchists and poseurs, linked only by the uncompromising renunciation of what one of them calls the kind of work you have to do to earn a living. And in that wonderful opening sequence, the taxi driver that you see in the front of that image drives Richard Linklater, who's sitting in the back. I mean, that is the director. And he's only in it for one scene, as everyone is only in it for one scene. But he starts telling him this story about alternative realities. He starts talking to the taxi driver about what would have happened if he hadn't gone in the taxi, but actually stayed at the bus station, and maybe he would have been picked up by a beautiful older woman who would have induced him into a life of perfect luxury and idleness. And the thing is, the taxi driver, of course, does not react in any way at any point during the scene. Again, it's about sort of the way that imaginative life multiplies the possibilities of our existence. So what can we learn about living a different life from these types? I do not counsel becoming like any one of them, nor would you listen if I did, of course, but impersonation is not the point. These types, I think, help us, not because they model an ideal life, but because they each in their own way put in question the kinds of compliant, overly pressured, stressful lives that too many of us actually do live. They invite us to become curious about lives governed by different desires, values, rhythms. They show us life when it isn't tyrannized by aims all the time. They give us glimpses of a non-instrumental, a non-purposive life. And art is one place in which to find this kind of life, but it is by no means the only one. Instead of a strictly regimented gym routine, which has to slot seamlessly into the schedule of the day, why do we not go for more long, aimless walks? Why do we not take time to sit down to coffee with a partner or a friend or anyone you like and talk without a time limit, without an agenda? Let your minds take you where they want to go rather than the quick 20-minute catch up. Why do we not stare out of windows with no thought but the view? Whether what you're looking at is a sublime lake or a row of street lamps. In other words, we need to protect time in which we throw off the tyranny of purpose. Because if you always know what you are doing and where you're going, you deprive yourself, we deprive ourselves of the possibility and the singular joy of surprise. There are very few surprises in a minutely scheduled life. And that, I think, is what it means to dwell in possibility rather than in prose. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation, and I think it's much needed in a culture that just seems to be obsessed with productivity and getting things done and efficiency. It's so refreshing to hear this point of view.
I kind of have two questions, so I'll try and make it as quick as possible. The first is, I'm curious as what your thoughts are between the idea of burnout and meaning in life. I know that they really connect hand in hand, but specifically the sort of extreme long-term burnout that kind of leads to that existential inertia almost. And we see that people trying to recultivate meaning in life through the Stoic revival and the New Age woo-woo movement, so to speak. And so that's my first question. My second is the idea of returning to pure being, the acknowledgement of inner experience as you phrased it. I'm curious how the mind can take that though and sort of deceive itself and create its own self-justifying narrative, and really how to find the sweet spot between that. Yeah, I'm curious the idea of returning to inner experience and sort of just leaving time for nothing. I'm curious how the mind can take that and sort of deceive itself and create this self-justifying narrative where you end up in this lazy state permanently. And I'm curious really how to find the sweet spot between being in that sort of mode and the productivity trap.
Yeah, the link between burnout and the meaning of life. Funny enough, Niall and I were talking before we started, and I was saying that the guy who sort of first coined the term burnout in a specific sort of diagnostic context, Herbert Freudenberger, was a clinical psychologist, American clinical psychologist. He coined the term around 1974, and actually, interestingly, he was working with employees in the caring professions, in social work, in medicine, in medically related nursing, and the sort of sheer administrative and sort of laborious burden of their lives was obscuring for them why the work was meaningful in the first place. That what had led to states of weariness and disillusion and anger, a lot of anger, workers becoming very sort of snappish and angry with the people using their services. But what had led to it is because the culture of targets and productivity had gotten in the way of their own appreciation of why they were doing this work. And there's nothing more disappointing in a way. I mean, if you stack shelves for a living, that's kind of okay, because clearly it's very unlikely you're going to think of it as the epicenter of the meaning of your life. Life happens somewhere else, and you do this to earn a wage. But if you have invested in a particular vocation as meaningful, and you're not able to access that meaningfulness, I think it's one of the things that really leads to burnout. So burnout is an experience of the world in which nothing touches you. There's nearly 20 years before Freudenberger, the first sort of, I think, sort of cultural circulation of the term was actually from a novel by Graham Greene called A Burnt Out Case. And A Burnt Out Case is about an architect who is also kind of oversaturated with achievement, with high society, with everything that the sort of decadent Western world can offer him. And he goes to work in a leper colony in West Africa. And he calls himself a burnt out case because he says, just like the limbs of the lepers are sort of cut off, cauterized so that they don't feel anything, that's how he feels inside, that his nerves are sort of leprous, that he feels nothing, that meaning has been sort of drained from the world. So I think burnout is the burning out of everything that touches us, that gives us a sense that there's something meaningful and at stake in the very fact of being alive. And I think it's for that reason that burnout so often can lead to a kind of existential reevaluation. And certainly some of the people who have come to me in psychoanalysis have come, I think, in search of a space in which to reevaluate the question of what it means to be alive, if it doesn't mean to be the most sort of successfully high achieving person. And in terms of the sweet spot, I mean, it's an important question because it's so difficult. I would say that at the moment, the culture is so heavily weighted towards one end, between, if you like, the slob and the maximally productive high achiever. It's so weighted towards the high achiever. Everything that our culture and our society orients us towards is activity and visible achievements that can be sort of paraded and displayed, particularly, I think, with the advent of social media. So I think we'd have to swing pretty far in the other direction. Can the mind trick us? I don't think the mind tricks us into becoming sort of permanently slobbish. I think that if our lives matter to us, we won't lose the investment just because we switch out occasionally and sort of want to do something else. I don't think of that as a risk. I think that it's much more of a risk to deny those impulses. That's when burnout happens.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes, I can, yeah.
Okay, I hope I've sort of rejoined as a panelist, I think it's come out. Okay, hi, wonderful talk. And the whole theme of doing and being modes, it comes up quite a lot in my client work, but I've even known it happen, someone just didn't even understand the idea of being mode. Anyway, because the whole idea of, the productivity trap you've been talking about is very much a systemic issue, explained, from what Max Weber, his idea about it. What suggestions might you have to try to change that? I mean, I wonder, this idea, let's say Bhutan, of this gross national happiness rather than the focus on gross domestic product economics. I wonder whether that's something that's, could be part of that shift. What suggestions do you have?
I think that one of the things we need to do in our sort of immediate, recently traumatized history is to reevaluate the meaning of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I think that the pandemic, the post-pandemic, has bounced us into a panic to recover, to go back to normal. We see that in the sort of gleeful and possibly premature sort of, disposal of masks, and in a kind of zeal to embrace the kind of expansive lifestyle that was lost to us for 2 years. And of course, that is completely understandable. But what we risk is losing all the gains of that period, which were first registered, of course, in the sort of massive environmental improvements. The fact that there was a kind of break in the wheels of productivity also meant that levels of pollution and all kinds of other, and sort of waste of resources decreased as well. And I think one can also think of that as having sort of very potent symbolic value for the way we think about our own resources as well, the way that we expend so much of ourselves on not just being productive, but being seen to be productive and displaying our own productivity. So I think that what we need is a kind of a public conversation, having sort of been through a lot of enforced withdrawal from that expansive, frenetic life. We need a conversation about, well, what it is that makes life worth living, I think. Because what one finds when people come to the consultant room burnt out, and maybe you find the same thing, is that that's exactly the question that has imposed itself on burnt out people.
Professor Cohen, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. That was really interesting, and I'm seeing some comments in the chat here. People, they got a lot from that. So well done, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Don't be doing any work. Take it easy, go for a walk. In addition to your book, Not Working, are there any other books that sort of come to mind that you'd recommend people to check out in this for this on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that I would recommend really, that I like a lot, is Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing, which I hope would be a nice companion to Not Working.
Great. Okay, right. Well, that'll do. Professor Cohen, have a great rest of your Sunday.